Okay, before we get started, if you'll open your chat window, you may not be able to find it immediately, but if you either stretch out your window, this is for our guests, if you stretch out your Zoom window, or you click on the word more at the bottom of your screen to the right, you should see a blank that says chat. And if you choose chat, not only will you be able to see any text messages that we send to each other or that I use to announce or offer a website or something like that, you will also be able to ask questions. Since one unfortunate aspect of the webinar format is that on Zoom, guests are not allowed to speak. That is, you won't have a microphone feed into the meeting. So we'll handle the question and answers of the panelists via the chat screen. So if you click on chat, you should be able to see a window on the right side, right column of your Zoom screen that will allow you to see the chat. So right now in the chat, I'm going to post the URL for the gallery site that Jess Smith, our digital lab manager in film and media studies and studio art, has put together for the students' projects. I'm going to post that now so you can link on it. I would recommend that you link to it because what I'm going to ask the participants, the panelists, to do is to share their images. If they want to speak about a particular image on one of the pages of their comics, they'll share that image. But if you would like to have another window open at which you can just look for yourself at the entire story that each of our participants has put up, or look at the students' artist statements which accompany these 4-page final project comics, then you're free to do that and kind of wander through at your leisure. Even if you've looked at them before, might be a good idea to have the page open. So what I've given you here is the page that discusses the final project and what the final project is all about. And I'll refer to that in my opening remarks here. So welcome to everyone. It's great to see the students back. I've really missed you guys. I'm not ashamed to say it. It's been an extended term. So, we turned in our grades yesterday, which is 2 weeks after we usually do. And Thanksgiving, was a kind of stopgap between the end of the term and finals, which has not happened in years at Dartmouth. Usually we're finished with finals by the time Thanksgiving rolls around. So in this year of COVID, there are lots of surprises, and this has turned out to be one of them. But it is great to have a chance to sit down and with the students and hear them speak about and present and discuss their work. 10 of the students from the class have agreed to participate in this presentation. There were 19 students altogether. This is a completely voluntary event. So the students are here simply because they want to show their work to you and to each other and to discuss it a little bit. So this doesn't have any bearing on their grades. It's just about intellectual business. It's just about digging in a little bit further into the discussions of comics and film and adaptation that we have been following for this term. So I'd like to just say a couple of words about the class and about what you're about to see more generally before I ask the students to each introduce themselves. What I'm going to have you do is we're going to go in old-fashioned alphabetical order, which for someone like me whose last name begins with Y, it's oppressive, and I understand that alphabetical order is oppressive. But nevertheless, that's the way that the stories, the 4-page projects have been listed in on the website, and I see no reason to follow up that order. So what I'm going to do is have each of the students introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their project, share a page if they'd like to, and then we'll hold all the question and answer until the very end, after the 10 students have done their brief presentations. Okay, sound good? Okay, so welcome to everyone who is turning up to see sons, daughters, besties, siblings, whomever, to take a look at the projects that they put together. This course is called The Graphic Novel and Film, or Cinema and the Graphic Novel and the Wiles of Adaptation is a sort of dream title I've got for this course. Since it brings up a lot of questions that it never entirely answers, although we find a lot of new paths toward answers. to what comics and film have in common and what they can learn from each other, or what we can learn as creators as well as analysts and critics from each of the media that will help us to perhaps expand the possibilities of aesthetic experimentation, of storytelling, and of representation itself between these two media. So this course starts from a simple observation that comics and film share a basic definition in common. That is, they both present images, usually framed images, presented in sequence. Very, very simple way to begin. And since the beginning of comics and film, which really appeared on the scene at the end of the 19th century in a full-blown kind of, capitalist produced and capitalist distributed way, almost simultaneously with one another. And so comics and film borrowed tropes of representation, of storytelling, of narration, and framing from each other almost from the very beginning. As soon as there was one medium or the other, they were already stealing from each other. And trying out ways of telling stories based on techniques used in the other medium by other artists working within that medium. So the course is intended to test what can be learned about the mechanics and techniques of either medium via a comparative analysis that begins with this kind of oversimplistic collapse, that there is this similarity between film and comics that was evocative and provocative to the earliest filmmakers and cartoonists who worked in newspaper cartooning at the end of the 19th century. But that this is really only a beginning, and it's a bit of a red herring, because each of these media has its own techniques and its own temporality, its own way of unfurling time and space for us. That means that each medium does things that the other medium can't do, and that has posed a challenge to both cartoonists and filmmakers constantly, whether they're animators or live action filmmakers over the past century and change of cinematic history, as well as cartoon history and comic history. So throughout the term, we use specific films and graphic novels to demonstrate similarities and distinctions between these different media and their possibilities of expression, representation, and communication, both the possibilities we already know and those that such intermediate comparisons can begin to reveal to us that we weren't aware of before. We have all been fortunate enough to have such a group, such a terrific and energetic group of 19 intrepid, tenacious, enthusiastic minds gathered to pursue these questions, not knowing exactly where we'd end up until we finally, got to the end of the line and worked on these final projects. But there's just concluding statements for now about how specific elements of construction and effects of form and style transform characters, actions, and setting into a world as built by a graphic novel, or as built by a storyboard, or as built by animated or live action film. So as I mentioned, I've put up the post, a URL that will allow you to have a look at the assignment, and I'll just move to that very briefly now. The final project, if you click on the final project button beneath the Scott McCloud header, and let me not forget, before we go any further, that Jess Smith, again, the manager of the digital lab in the BVAC, a building that almost none of us has seen anything of this term, which is very strange. But Jess Smith designed this website. She put it together. She uploaded and arranged and organized all of the student projects. We are so grateful to her for all of her work on that. I also want to thank Peter Cerdelli, who put together this webinar, also made the fabulous graphic, that wonderful poster that all of us will probably want to print and put on our walls when this is over. And put together the infrastructure of this evening's Zoom tech, as well as flinging the word far and wide that this event was taking place. So thank you, and a quick but hearty round of applause for both of these AV specialists who've done so much for this class. But if you look at the final project assignment now, the project is very briefly, although students know I'm a lot more verbose than this in the actual assignment, but this is a very good distillation of it that Jess did for us. To complete the fall term, students created a 4-page comic and an artist's statement. The 4-page comic portion investigates a concept covered in the course to further demonstrate, rethink, or thoughtfully challenge the concept as it relates to comics and films. The artist statement explains and illustrates the concept investigated in the comic and asks the student to reflect on the comic and its success in demonstrating the concept. And let me just say one more thing about the project, that this is the first time I've ever asked all students, not made it optional, to do a final 4-page comic as a kind of criticism, a kind of intervention in the critical discourse and discussion about how comics works, or how film works, or how adaptation works, and what different techniques can cause, or can present different possibilities, challenges, complications. We've racked up a lot of jargon in this class, a lot of very comic specific and film specific terms like arthrology, which refers to the way in which panels are articulated in a page. On a page as a kind of analog to editing in film, except the temporality of editing is one shot after another that replaces the previous one. Whereas in comics, the arthrology of panels on a page means that we are looking at any panel we like for as long as we like, for as long as we're looking at that page. So whereas time is taken away, the control over the temporality of the reading experience or viewing experience is in the hands of the film and the filmmaker and the film projector, whatever that machine might be in film. In comics, the temporality of the experience is much more controlled by the reader. And so, those kinds of basic distinctions between reading experience of one medium versus reading experience of another means that there are very different possibilities for playing with time and representing different kinds of temporalities between the two media. And so what I wanted the students to do, and as I said, this is the first time I've told students, you have no choice, you must all do these 4-page comics, was not to think as, so much as professional artists. Because even Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse, once said that nobody, if you look at it, if you see a great comic, you're not necessarily looking at a great drawing or a great set of drawings. Drawings and the quality of drawings and rendering are, very rarely the most important thing about comics communication. And he's quite adamant about that. So what I asked the students to do was not to concentrate on their rendering, but to concentrate on what they could do with panels and layout and the composition of individual panels that could, tweak meanings and give us more significance than just a line of dialogue could do by itself. We could, bring the reader into a story in a different way, or cause us to look at the page as a whole design, as opposed to looking at every individual panel as though that were where all the action was. That was where all the action was, in that particular moment. So the students were encouraged to think of the comics they were producing as criticism rather than as just comics, although they were comics as well. And then the artist statement was a chance for them to stand back for a couple of pages and say, here's what I meant. Here's what I really wanted to try to do. Here's the concept that I investigated. And here's where I think I went right. And here's where I wish that I had tried something else. And just be completely honest about that. And well, you're going to hear this for yourselves in just a moment. So I thank you for listening to my spiel, and I will open this up to the group. If you click over to final project, to student work on the website, you will see our first participant is one Kira Cannon. And Kira, if you could just introduce yourself, say where you're from, and this goes for everyone. We'll just go in alphabetical order. Just say where you're from, what year you are, and you can just break right into telling us about your project. And as I mentioned to the students, they can pretty much say whatever they want for 2 to 5 minutes or 3 to 5 minutes, as long as they tell us something about, well, what the artist statement is telling us. That is, what the point of producing this particular story with its particular choices was all about, and what concept or issue they were trying to illustrate with the comics that they've produced. So, Kira, take it away, if you will.
Hi, my name is Kiara Cannon. I'm a 22 and I'm from Atlanta, currently in Atlanta right now. And do I need to share or can they?
If you'd like to, if you want to share just one page, that's fine. But as I mentioned, the site, if you click on the link that I posted a little while ago in the chat, people should be able to go right to your comic and even scroll through it as you're talking about it. So it's up to you whether you want to point out a particular panel or a particular page.
Mhm.
but you have the power to share if you need to.
Okay, great. I will start by just reading out the introduction of my artist statement. Art and its various mediums have always allowed me to express my emotions honestly, providing me the power and control to translate that which I cannot verbalize, but only express. In my piece, I chose to explore how comics can use color to express the subjective state of depression. Throughout the panels, mediated through an anthropomorphic cat-tiger cartoon, I used a journal entry structure to guide the reader through the subject's descent into a depressive state. The title, Mood Indigo, is the namesake of Nina Simone's famed jazz rendition, originally composed and lyricized by Duke Ellington, Barney Biggert, and Irving Mills. The main and only character within the comic, Nina, gains its name from the influential performer who throughout her life and career suffered from bipolar depression. Within the comic, Nina's internal experiences, primarily based on my personal struggles with depression, are made externally visible with an assortment of diffusing purple and blues, along with an ending full-page panel featuring the concluding statement, "Blues go home." And to further explain my process, just developing this comic and also interacting with the medium of comicking, I have the process that I really experienced was being able to authentically express myself within art and within a medium that allows me to expand beyond the verbal, because emotions are complex, just like comics are complex. And I found specifically when drawing inspiration from feeling blue or feeling down, specifically with the parallel to the song Mood Indigo, um, I really felt artistically grounded within my emotions and was able to understand through the process of comicking, how experiences specifically, or just how the subjective state and subjective experiences can be mutated on the page, rather than like in life when you can't necessarily see when someone is down or depressed. Um, and I will share my favorite panel right now. My favorite panel actually features a typo, but that is neither here nor there. This is the third page, and the previous page features uh, like the blue on the main character Nina's face growing, and then features a journal entry saying, "I fall apart." And the subjective state within this panel is specifically just mirrored by Nina physically being within pieces. And I really love this because it still maintains the iconicity of Nina as this anthropomorphic cat tiger thing, but also really parallels like the feeling of dissociation, and an externalized feeling that is typically experienced by people who suffer through depression. Um, and yes, that is really all I have to say about my comic. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you very much, Kira. And please hang on. We're just going to have everyone present very briefly, and then we'll have the chance to do Q&A and discuss each other's work if you like afterwards. But let's move forward to Michelle. Michelle Chen, tell us who you are and what you did.
Yeah, hi, I am Michelle. I'm a 22. I study computer science, so this is actually like, this class is a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I had a really fun time with it. And I guess I will go into my comic now. So I'm just going to pull it up as a PDF. So hopefully that works as screen sharing. Let's see. Okay. You're not obligated to look at it. I'll just sort of talk out loud, maybe summarize my statement. But basically, this is a comic about something that I've called stylistic dehumanization, which is actually pretty similar to what Kiara did, in which you have a character that you assume to be human and the audience assumes to be human, but they're actually depicted as an animal. And usually the species that is chosen for that depiction tells you something about the character and slash or about the way that the narrative is going to go. And so I was really interested in how these narrative elements lend themselves to this kind of portrayal and vice versa. I think that it's a really interesting rhetorical depiction. I've seen it in a lot of works such as Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which was previously mentioned in this webinar. I've also seen it in some other works. Some of my favorite ones as well just involve like cartoon birds and whatnot. And so I'm always just thinking, you know, like, why choose this kind of depiction? Why not just go with a human? And so in this case, I'm trying to try it out myself, and I'm trying to challenge myself to think critically about this narratological element. And so essentially this story, I call it ungulating. A little bit of context, an ungulate is a hooved animal. So like a horse or a goat or a sheep. And undulating is sort of like a state of uncertainty where something is like, I don't know, sinusoidal. And so this comic is sort of just about existing in a state of uncertainty with a transfer student, who just transferred to the main character's school. As you can see here, I hope you can see my mouse. It's sort of depicted as a religious school, private one, judging by their uniforms. And it's not very explicit, but the school is also a sort of like fundamentalist leaning one. And so typically among more fundamentalist Christian religions, goats aren't depicted very fondly. There's a parable that sort of sees them as very malevolent and hard to trust. And so that was sort of what I was playing off of for this comic. As you progress through these pages, the color in the background gets darker and darker. The art style sort of stays cutesy. I tried to make it cute, even though I usually don't draw like this. And there's just a lot of speculation going on with this character. Like, who is she? Like, why is she here? Like, what does her family do? Why won't she invite people over to her house? And then eventually she and the main character start going out very spontaneously. And one conversation that they do have really sets them off, where she's just like, oh, you don't have to engineer this like facade of likability for other people, but I do. Like, you get to be plain and uninteresting, but I don't get to be that way. And of course he's insulted because like, why would you say that to someone? But I think that this conversation does belie a sort of tension that exists in this dynamic and in her own personal life as well. So at this point, it's sort of established that this character is a little untrustworthy. She's sort of fake. And she like just sets off false alarms, or not false alarms, just alarms in this main character's head. And so like there's a pathological element to the way that he sees her as a goat, because that's some of his distrust and mistrust manifesting. And so finally on the last page, this is the one that I actually bothered coloring and shading and just rendering. He just discovers like the truth, and the truth is that her family is like cultish and satanic. And Fia, which is the nickname that she's gone by throughout this comic, is like girlish shorthand for like Baphomet, which is the satanic goat, or the sabbatical goat rather. And so this reveal is sort of built up to, starting from page 1, just through the stylistic dehumanization of this character. And so like, you know, it helps you tell a story in a very subtle way and in a very delicate way. And I think that what I concluded is that like, it's a really powerful narrative device when used correctly. I think that maybe I could have been a little bit more clever with it. Maybe I could have drawn the other people as sheep, and then I have one goat and it's like, oh, I wonder what's going on there. But of course it's a little too late now. So that's basically my comic. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too much. And yeah, it's just, you know, anthropomorphic animals, stylistic humanization. That's basically it.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Not rambling at all. In fact, I'm impressed so far by the brevity of how much you're able to concentrate into these very short chats about the work. So off to a great start. So Michael, I think is back online. He's got a new set of headphones, and we're going to try to move back to him now. So if you just want to flip back to silence number 1, the Michael's comic. Michael, are you with us?
Yep. Can you hear
Okay.
me now?
Yep, sure can.
All right. Thanks. So hi, I'm Michael Carty. I'm 21, and I thoroughly enjoyed this class. So I'll share my screen to start. Do you see the first page of my comic
Yes.
here?
Mm-hmm.
So the main topic I was trying to tackle in my project was, how does a comics reader read the page differently from a regular prose reader? and specifically, how does like the size, shape, and nature of panels affect the reader's experience? So to really try and demonstrate the narrative power that comics panels have, I tried to choose the most boring scenario as possible and stretch it into 4 pages and see if I could just make the story captivating, just pretty much essentially just through the panel shape and size. The story I chose was Woman Sneezes on Her Coworkers, which at first actually Professor Young gave me the suggestion to, as like a very simple, boring story. He said, how about water dripping out of the faucet, which would have been, which I thought was too big of a challenge for me. So I gave a little bit more of a story to it. But the water dripping out of the faucet did inspire me to think of snot dripping out of this person's nose.
I created a monster.
So I'll just quickly go through it. So page 1, I like the standard comics panel is obviously the rectangular panel, and oftentimes the full page is shaped like a grid. And here I use all triangular and trapezoidal panels, and I have either like, for the most part, I have close-ups on people's faces or clothing, and then I have like little snippets of dialogue to make it seem like there's tension in the room. And then I have one panel that shows it's not a close-up, and you can kind of tell that hopefully you can tell that they're at like some sort of business meeting. And there's all these different images, but then the only repeated image is this nose through 3 panels. And I tried to make it a little more obvious that it is repeated by making the only color on the page this little snot dripping out of her nose. And the second page, I use another like unconventional panel style by I shaped the first panel into arrows and to give the reader like 2 directions to choose. So this woman, first she has snot dripping out of her nose, and then there's a little bug buzzing around her ear. So if you follow on the top, you see the bug just getting annoyingly closer and closer to her ear. And then you're brought to this last panel, which bleeds off the page, and you see that she slaps the bug and it seems to die. But then you also, if you read this way first, you also see she slaps the bug, but then she also sniffs her nose. And then you still have to look at the other path. Like it's not like you choose one path and that's what happens. Both paths do happen. So either way, you have to go back and read from the beginning again. This page, I was kind of inspired by this page in The Dark Knight that had it had like conventional images and panels, but then the word boxes like were almost like you couldn't tell which order to read the texts in. And so I tried to mimic that here with like a lot of I'd imagine that you'd read, "We have to here first. Can you fire him already?" And these are just random people in the office speaking. But then your eye might drift over to this page. And then when you get here, you're probably going to want to keep looking down. But if not, like then some people might go over to this side of the page and start reading some of these words. And then you might get drawn back into this image. So I was hoping that this page just brings your eye like all over the place.
Mm.
But then at the end, I hope that everyone will at least once see these 4 images in a row at the same time. See that it's not just dripping, and like she's about to sneeze. And then this last person's comment gets cut off. And then the last page, I didn't, so I have the part of Achu, but I don't have the chew part of Achu. But I tried to like spell the chew part with just the gooey shape of this last panel, this central last panel, and I colored it in the same color as the snot to emphasize that. And on the top, there is a bit of like sense of time here because on the top the snot is still projectiling, but then on the bottom, it has reached its mark or whatever. And there's someone whispers "bless you," and the bug is buzzing around again. Maybe it's a new bug. But I had a lot of fun with this project, and I was pretty much just trying to show that even the like simplest, most boring of stories could be made entertaining just if you put it on a comics page and you mess with conventional panel styles.
Right. What could be very straightforward winds up being something that could be read in about 4 different directions, but they, they all lead sort of to the same ending. I've got to say, Michael, that I didn't notice until just this moment how much this story is about contagion in the age of COVID. It's, I feel very thick-headed for not, jumping on that right away. Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Let us, there's so much to talk about that I find it very difficult not to want to talk about each of them as they go by, but let's move on to Isaac, Dating in the Apocalypse. Isaac, take it away.
Hi, I'm Isaac. I'm a 23 from Northern Virginia, where I currently reside. And my comic is Dating in the Apocalypse. So it's Dating in the Apocalypse is inspired by an essay that we read in class by Benoit Peters called Four Conceptions of a Page. And Peters divides these four conceptions based on sort of the relationships between the narrative happening on the page and the layout of the page, how the page is assembled. And the relationship defines what type of page it is. So the different conceptions are conventional, rhetorical, productive, and decorative, where going from the first one to the last one, the first one is more narrative dominant and the last one is more composition dominant. And so I guess I'll share a couple of the pages.
Please do.
So let's see here. So I go in order from conventional to rhetorical to productive to decorative. And starting with the first page, the whole comic is a play on the 9-panel grid. It's a 9-panel even rectangular grid on every single page. But Peters hints at this in his essay where he believes that maybe the grid is a little more versatile than how people conventionally use it, in this case, with the conventional utilization on the page. And a conventional page looks something like this, where the layout doesn't have really anything to do with the stuff that's happening inside the page. As you progress through the story, the relationship between the narrative and the page changes. This page is rhetorical usage, where the story sort of bleeds across all the pages, and the layout is influenced by the narrative. The narrative sort of defines the layout. In this case, there's dialogue going back and forth, and so the image bleeds across the page outside the panels in a polyptych. In the third page, this is the productive utilization of the page. I'm inspired by a page from, I don't have it on my desk, but End of the Effing World by Charles Forsman. There's a layout similar to this that introduces multiple readings of the page, where you can read the page left to right, and then down a row, and then left to right, and down a row, and left to right. Or you could read just the panels with text in them from top in a sort of diagonal across the page. And this productive use of the page is more like the layout is generating elements of the narrative, right? How you progress through the sequence depends on how you read the page, the arthrology, or a little bit about the arthrology of the panels. And finally, the last page is more decorative in its utilization. And in this page, I tried to obtain a simultaneous reading where there really isn't any sequence expressed at all. You could read left to right, you could read down across the page, but it's not cause and effect. It's sort of the most iconostatic image I could create, which is another concept that we talk about. And I think it would be interesting because the last 2 pages I stole from other comics to share the images from those other comics. So in this case, this page from End of the Effing World. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Mhm.
awesome. Fantastic. End of the Effing World, where there are these sort of multiple readings that make it almost montage, like film montage sequence type reading. And this page from Watchmen, which I blatantly stole because I think it's a great page. Yeah, I think that is all.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Isaac. And I think, did I tell you this? I know I've told this to a couple of students that Wally Wood, the great sci-fi and superhero, mostly sci-fi and horror cartoonist of the 1950s and 60s, once said that never draw if you can copy, and never copy if you can trace. This is a man who made many, many, many pages of comics in his life and fully believed in, ripping off other cartoonists as a mode of creative production.
You have to steal when you can.
I suppose so.
definitely
It's almost like, it's almost like an oath of honor among some cartoonists. But in this case, quotation and citation are what we're doing here. So you've cited your sources. Everything's above board. We're in good shape. Thank you, Isaac. Okay, so Sophie Frank, would you like to introduce us to your work, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie. I am from Los Angeles, and I'm a graduate student in comparative literature. And my comic actually is inspired by a contemporary literary theory class that I took this fall. We read a piece of philosophy by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who are French philosophers. And in 1980, they published a text called 1,000 Plateaus, Mille Plateaux. And in the introduction, they set out this theory for culture, literary studies, but also social structures and political structures that they refer to as a rhizome. So instead of looking at our world through hierarchies, they encourage people to look at it in a rhizomatic way. So for example, if you think of grasslands that sends up shoots, there's no hierarchy, everything is equal. There are multiple entry and exit points. And actually, I came home to this week's New Yorker and noticed that we've actually got a hierarchy right here on the cover. So they really are pervasive, everything from governmental structures to even family trees have hierarchical structures. And so I was thinking about how can comics work to subvert this phenomenon of hierarchies, and how can comics embrace the rhizome? So I will go ahead and share my screen with you all. While I'm doing that, shout out to my grandmas for logging on, and my cousin Raven, whom you'll see features prominently in my comic, and also happy first night of Hanukkah to everyone. So here is a page from my comic, which is about a road trip that I took this summer with Raven. We drove from Washington State to Wisconsin, where I dropped them off at college, and I continued on to New Hampshire. So in this page, you'll see that I'm actually playing with the comic's gutter. So when you have, I'll show you the first page of my comic, like Isaac had in the last presentation, I've got a 3x3 grid here with framed images, and then the space around the images or behind the images is referred to as the gutter. A lot of comics theorists like Scott McCloud and Thierry Gronstein, who we read in this class, say that we shouldn't fetishize the gutter. There's nothing that special about it. But actually, as I try to show in my comic, it is a site where we can work to deconstruct hierarchies. So what I have here is a moment when Raven and I were driving along in Montana, pulled off the road to visit the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. If y'all remember General Custer's last stand from US history, that's what happened here. So I created a 9x9 grid, but instead of having a panel in the center like the others, I'm letting the background image shine through, which here actually is the gravestone of a Cheyenne warrior who died in the battle. And so, it's actually grasslands, pretty rhizomatic, maybe a little overwrought. But what I'm trying to do here is show how the gutter can be a space where we can decenter the hierarchy of the structure of a comics page and let other things that may not make it into the frame or be centered in storytelling really shine through.
Thank you, Sophie. And it's exciting that Raven is here too. I get to meet someone from the comic. That's terrific. And thanks again for all the guests for showing up tonight. I know it means a lot to the students, and it means a lot to me as well that you came through to spend some time with us to walk through this very diligent and very inventive work. So let's move on. Thank you again, Sophie, to the next person in alphabetical order, who is Jim Hackathorn. Jim, take it away.
Hey, and I really enjoyed this class. I've taken another class on graphic novels and a couple other classes that have included graphic novels, and I've all really loved the work that I've done in all these. My project, I wanted to kind of explore what you could do with text as it kind of manifests and affects the kind of material sort of reality and space of the comic as sound and as, you know, something maybe more. And so I had, I'll just share my screen. I basically wrote an adaptation of The Color Out of Space, the Lovecraft short story, and have this sound that lands and comes and starts to kind of affect the things around it. It starts to kind of invade people's minds by breaking into their thought bubbles and sort of invading the space around them and kind of taking over the panels, and then it replaces the panels themselves as it kind of breaks further into their mind. Kind of fails once and floats around a bit more, kind of recognizes that it doesn't feel right. And this page I really liked. I wanted to kind of have just like multiple frames kind of, and the sort of movement between the frames sort of start to layer. And so you have a window pane in the top left and the kind of thing outside. And it's sound at this point, so it just kind of bleeds in through the window and see someone reading a comics page that mirrors the page we're on here. And to get onto this, it kind of breaks through the mirror on the page and sort of takes over what's there, starts to kind of break around the panels, and then sort of gets into this one's mind that way. And then again, kind of realizes that something isn't right, realizes that it's still text, and wants to kind of break out and take over the reader, essentially. And so then kind of starts to do the same thing, breaks around the panels and kind of gets out, and sort the idea is that it kind of works its way into your own mind by kind of recognizing the fact that it's being read. And so again, I just kind of thought it would be fun to play around with what you can do with text and what it and then I also didn't really know and don't know how to draw. So this was another fun way to do this without that.
Extremely clever workaround to the drawing issue. But you know, since we experience what would be experienced as sound within the narrative as image when we read text, to play with its possibilities, not just as image itself, but also as frame. That is, you know, what makes images available to us is a pretty. It takes advantage of that visuality in a way that we didn't see many cartoonists taking advantage of it this term. So it's a really interesting experiment. Thank you, Jim. Our next panelist is Samuel Miller. Sam, where are you from? What's your class and what did you do?
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a 24, and I kind of wanted to play around with kind of the notion that panels, like the kind of the democratic grid, the rectangular panel shapes, and I was kind of speculating if panels kind of lie on this spectrum, where the rectangular, square, democratic panel is on one end, what can I do on the complete opposite end and completely deviate from kind of the familiar panel layout? And so my comic, I will share it right here. I'll zoom in. I tried to kind of play with kind of expectations. And so every panel in this, none of the panels are rectangular, and I tried to limit the number of kind of straight edges that I use. And to kind of do this, what I wanted to kind of accomplish is to see how I can represent kind of a layered meaning that happens not only within the panel but outside of it with the shaping of the panels themselves. And so I have a couple examples that I'd like to focus on. The first one's on the first page. I frame this kind of in a superhero comic way. I really like Batman. And so I kind of tried to accomplish this through kind of a superhero fight, Batman versus Catwoman. And so on the first page, I have this kind of 2-panel sequence that where the shapes of the panels are the characters' heads. And so if you can see within the characters' heads is kind of where the story is taking place. And so I try to kind of in doing this represent that, you know, both characters are thinking of each other. They're not just physically standing on like this rooftop city scene. They're also kind of internalizing the encounter. And then kind of as you go down the page, I try to play with speech bubbles. So instead of the characters explicitly talking to each other, I have them kind of represent what they're trying to say with actual pictures. And then on the next page, I have this 2-panel sequence where instead of showing the readers explicitly that Batman is getting scratched by Catwoman, I have the outline of the panel be kind of a scratch mark, and then the direct next panel is shaped like a claw, and so within the panel, all you really see is Batman kind of recoiling, and then Catwoman kind of getting into a stance. But the layered meaning is kind of that he has been scratched, and I try to kind of that closure to kind of push that actions can occur within outside of the panel, and not only within it. And then another instance that I would like to bring up is on this page where inside of the panels, Batman and Catwoman are fighting each other, but outside of the panel, you see the first panel is shaped like Catwoman's head, more or less, and then the second kind of set of panels is shaped like her goggles. And if you see within this panel, she no longer has her goggles on, and so I kind of wanted to represent, like, I thought that maybe having the Democratic panels here, and then trying to represent that her goggles had flown off within a couple panels, maybe that would be less efficient than doing it this way. So I kind of layer 2 actions on top of each other. And then on the last page, I kind of play with like symbolism and kind of character emotions. Sorry. And so there's this explosion on page 3. And then on page 4, first of all, I tried to do something with kind of sequential dynamism with Batman's cape. The character's kind of moving upwards, and the panel, which is his cape, is kind of down, and then playing with kind of the physics of the cape. As he lands, the cape responds by kind of going up. But then in the last 2 panels, I tried to go back to this kind of combination, this complementary aspect of the panel shapes themselves, and have it so that Batman's kind of surprise that Catwoman is not there, and then his confusion as to where she went is kind of expressed not within the panel but outside of it. And so that's kind of where I wanted to go with this comic.
Thank you very much, Sam. The iconicity is part of a spectrum that we've discussed throughout the term, thanks to Scott McCloud, where iconicity is on one end of the spectrum and realism is on the other end, and the cartoonists can choose different spots or even transform depending on which kind of character they want to represent within the same story. They can experiment with where they want to place their art on that spectrum. But you've chosen to do that with the panel shapes themselves and turn them into icons. which, in some ways kind of turns the game upside down. Very interesting stuff. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's see who's next. Looks like Zadis Contreras is next. Zadis, please take it away. The floor is yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Sadie's Lismet. Also, I go by that name. I'm a 22 and I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, but I'm currently in Miami where I live. Yeah, so I love this class and I had a really great time. And I'm honestly a little afraid to go after what amazing things Samuel just did, but it's the vibes. So essentially, as the professor said, we went through a lot of specifics about comics and just like kind of breaking them down. And one aspect that I thought was really cool was the aspect of closure. And McLeod went in and like Sophie said, he said that it wasn't that amazing, but I think that gutters, like, and what happens between the gutters, which is like the space between the panels for those who don't know, are really essential to a story and the meaning the story has and how you interpret it. And I kind of wanted to mess with that in my comic just to kind of show, in fact, how important and how awesome closure is. And in my comic, I essentially took closure. Like, I don't know, I'm like kind of evil. I gave the reader some closure and then I took it back and said, you're wrong. This is not the closure. I tricked you, fool. So I'm gonna share my screen now so I can show you guys. And I kind of have to show you the whole comic, so sorry if you don't want to see it, but what I wanted to do only makes sense if you see the whole thing. So
We want to see it, Zadis. It's fine.
Okay. So yeah, so the story follows this young man right here, Jamal, as he just, during his day, and I purposely made the gutters really big here because I wanted the reader to like kind of figure out what's going on in between. Like, can Jamal see this weird creature lurking behind him? Can he not? And then boom, we have a confrontation here. And I just want to point this moon here out, just drag your eye here and just, I'm not gonna say anything else about it, but just perceive it, right? And then continuing to page 2, making the gutter smaller by adding more panels and therefore like kind of taking away the need for you to guess what's going on. And I'm adding here like information, right? So after he got confronted, he's running away. Then more panels and it's even smaller because I'm showing you what's actually happening, right? So Jamal got caught and there's a close-up of a knife right here. So ideally the reader would be like, oh my God, this is like a scary story. Jamal is dead. He got caught by this weird monstrous creature. And then page 4, I want it to be like a big reveal where the gutters are really small. Like I'm guessing like the gutters right here are really small because I have added all the information. Well, not really all, I guess there's still gutters as you can, imagine what's going on. And then as you read the comic, normally you realize, oh my gosh, this is not a scary story after all. It's actually like a movie scene. My favorite panel is actually on the first row, the last panel. And it's like the director gelling. Oh my God, my accent. Yelling at one of the crew members. I don't know if I zoom in, you guys can see it. Yelling at the crew members for not having the moon like up enough, like you can see the cable, and I just think that's hilarious. And yeah, you can see that like Jamal is not really dead, which is like, the climax of the story. He's not really dead. The director right here just wanted a really big close-up of the camera, obviously, because in a movie setting, he would want to scare the audience. So yeah, put a lot of work into it. I specifically like the monster. I think I drew him really cute, like the actor for it. But yeah, that is all, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Zadie, just to point something out about your artist statement, one thing you said that really brought your experiment home to me, and I should just say that in all cases, students were encouraged to think of these as experiments. Like, what would happen if I, induced closure and then kept introducing more and more information that shows that the closure that the reader performed was incorrect, or led them to draw incorrect assumptions, because I, the all-powerful cartoonist, have withheld information until plopping it in later. But one thing that brought it all together for me, Zadis, is when you say that in the original story, that knife on page 2 represents the murder of the central character, but on page 4 it represents the director's choice to have a close-up, and it's exactly the same panel, and the context produces that different meaning, that different significance of the image. So that's one of the moments where I think the experiment is clearly working, because the actual meaning of the panel within the narrative has transformed utterly at that point. So okay, now I'll shut up now and let the students take it back. Dustin, I'm not sure that Dustin Weiland is here. I didn't hear that he wasn't able to make it. He didn't contact me, but I don't see him on the list, unfortunately. So I hope everything's all right. If he does show up at the end, we'll certainly let him have his chance to present. But Dustin's work is definitely worth a close look, particularly since his 4 pages are arranged so that you can read them as individual pages, or you can read the first strip on each of the 4 pages from left to right, and then go down to the second strip on all 4 pages and read it from left to right. He gives a diagram, he presents a diagram of how that reading would be possible, or kind of map to that kind of reading in his artist statement. So have a look at that if you have it. It's based on a film that works with a lot of time shifts. It's a time travel sci-fi film, and he decided that there would be a way to do this in comics that would sort of respect the integrity of the complication of these 4 different time streams, or 3 different time streams, or whatever it is in the original film, while taking advantage of the fact that comics give the reader autonomy about how to choose to read, and how to be led through the different lines of the different vectors the story is it's possible to travel. Okay, I didn't explain that nearly as well as Dustin could have, I'm sure, but let's move on to our final presenter for now, who is Aniketh Yalamanchili. Please take it away, Aniketh.
Hey guys, I'm Aniketh. I'm a 23 and I'm from New Jersey. And so my comic also focused on closure, so I'll share it. With my comic, so in one of the texts that we had to read for this class was Scott McCloud, and in it, the guy, when he's explaining comics, he talks about this concept called closure, which Hades just talked about, and it's just connecting the 2 panels, which is you might do that by just imagining what's going on in between the panels. How did they get from this panel to the next panel? Stuff like that. And in the book, McCloud says he makes an assumption that closure is super specific or imaginative. So he was referencing panels where there was a murder of a guy whose neck was about to be chopped with an axe, and he says every reader can imagine the strength of the axe blow, the blood spurting and stuff like that. And I thought that was a bold assumption to make, because personally I didn't imagine the murder in that much detail. And so in the whole book, McCloud's talking about how closure is super imaginative, but then in class the professor brought up how closure could also be an intellectual preference. You just understand that a sequence of events happen to get you from one set of one panel to the next. So I tried to examine when closure could be more of an intellectual inference and when it more heavily relied on imagination with my comic. So and I approached this from 2 different ways. So with my first page, I titled it OG action to action and moment to moment. So action to action and moment to moment sequences are the types of transitions that I used in between panels on my on this first page. And so the page is just the first and second page both are of the same story, but you probably can get a better sense of the story from the first page. It's just the guy's you have besmirched my honor, old fool. I may be old, but my experience will allow me to best you. So it's just like standard medieval trash talk, and then they like have a fight. So you could see like they go from the first panel to the next panel, like fight, they're clashing swords, and then like it's like sort of like a play-by-play of the fight. Like the young guy pokes the old guy, and then the old guy falls to the floor and drops his sword, and the young guy's about to win, and then the old guy slowly outstretches his arm, picks up the sword, and then while the young guy's gloating, he like stabs him through the chest, so the old guy wins. And then on the next page, I used more aspect to aspect transitions. So I guess on the first page I used action to action to moment sequences, because like they're like sort of like shorter sequences almost, kind of, but also they just like tell more of the story within the panel. But on the second page, aspect to aspect transition just sort of like highlight different details of the environment. So like on the first page of this second page, first panel, like you see like a background shot of like the boat that they're on. Then the second page, it's like a zoom in shot. Third page, it's like a top down view. And like from reading the second page, like I basically tried to make it so like it's very like it's way harder to figure out what's going on than is it if you read the first page. And so in trying to answer this question of when closure is more inference and when it's more imagination, I basically like tried to make it so that when you have lots of information about what's going on, like on the first page, then you will essentially, I thought, have a more imaginative closure, because you're not trying so hard to figure out how to connect the panel so much as you are imagining the fight, like them clashing swords, him poking him and falling down and stabbing him while he's on the ground. Whereas on the second page, I felt as if maybe like closure would be more like just trying to figure out what happened, like using context clues, like on the last page, like the young guy's lying in a pool of blood and everyone's like, good job, old man. So like you can infer that the young old guy won the fight, but you're not really sure as to how it went down, so you can't imagine it in as much detail or as clearly. So I was assuming basically like it might be more of an inference here. And then the second two pages, I went from it in a different angle, which is like, or from the same angle, but like with a twist. So like the first two pages were basically like more information leads to, and more panels leads to like better imaginative closure, but less information, more ambiguously connected panels leads to inference closure. And then on the second, third and fourth pages, I adapted, like, you know that scene from The Matrix when Neo is like waving his arms and like dodging the bullets from Agent Smith? So that's what I tried to adapt. And I used the same formula as the first two pages, which is like on the third page, I had like action to action sequences and like subject to subject, basically like sequences where you could see lots of the story happening in the panels. And then the last page, aspect to aspect, where it's a lot more ambiguous about how things ended up where they were. And the reason I like differentiated the first two and the second two pages was because I thought that maybe like already being familiar with the story would impact like the way you imagine stories, or like, and that might impact your closure. So like my reasoning behind this would be like say somebody's like favorite part of this scene was like when Trinity shoots Agent Smith and says dodge this, like that's only like one panel on like this 6-panel third page. But then on the Matrix aspect to aspect last page, like honestly it's just like a beginning, middle, and an end, and like the reader's free to imagine however they want. So I was assuming that closure might be more imaginative if you already have like a familiar with the story on the last page.
Terrific. Yeah, two very different experiments with closure that end up, I think, proving some of the same things, but also suggesting the degree to which our imaginative work is both kind of circumscribed by everything from the drawing style to the way in which time is represented, so that we've got these aspect to aspect panels. If I didn't know the story of the Matrix, I would find this to be practically a series of non sequiturs, I think. And that's what's interesting about it, is there's still parts of a story or images from a story. And nevertheless, the closure doesn't do us a lot of good unless we already know the story, we have some very, very, very broad spectrums of inferences that we could make that might be very different from each other's. Okay. Great. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. And those questions can either be panelists asking each other questions, or they can be chat questions. So I encourage all of our wonderful audience to think about a question you'd like to ask and just type it to everyone, all panelists and attendants in the chat window. And I will ask the questions as they come. But in the meantime, do any of the panelists have any questions for each other about your work? You chatted about your own comments and thoughts pretty vigorously in the chat window. If anybody would like to expand one of those questions, please go ahead and speak up. And let's, by the way, before we move on, let's have a round of virtual applause for all the participants. And the work that you did really seemed to you've got each other's attention for sure. It's nice to see this conversation having a chance to continue. So any questions among the panelists for each other, or any questions from the group? Yes, Adis, please.
I have a question for Michelle. Do you think there would have been any difference if you made all of the characters animals versus making only one character animal and the rest human?
Yeah, I actually thought about this a lot, so I'm really glad you asked this. I know that I raised the possibility of having everyone else be like a sheep so that you literally have a goat amongst sheep. But I think I also was just like, oh, what if I just made like the other people like benigner animals, just like little kittens or whatever. I don't know. The ultimate reason why I decided on humans was that it would simply require less thinking, but also less distraction. Because I think that I didn't really want people to be like, oh, like, why is this person, like, why is the main character like a dog? Like, what does this say about him? And so I was sort of like, I want to make it so that like, it is evidently the protagonist seeing this one character as an animal and like dehumanizing her in his head because of his mistrust for her. So I think that if everyone were an animal, that would be like, it would probably offer a different narrative. I think that, I don't know, it would probably be some sort of like, it would lend itself more easily to broader commentary on like society as a whole or whatever. But that wasn't really what I was going for. So yeah, I definitely considered it. So I'm really glad you asked.
Well, if I could just follow up on that, Michelle, I'll follow up on Zadie's question. When we were first talked about, when we first had our workshop meeting, just the one-on-one meeting about your project, I wondered if you were going to end up trying to undercut the expectation that you would build up in the first couple of pages around, the expectation of her as a goat. And, because you were interested in the expectations or the kinds of potential prejudices that are being solidified or kind of, hardened by even the choices that Spiegelman makes to make Jews, to represent Jews as mice, that he certainly doesn't mean it in a racist way. He's trying to reproduce the way that the Nazis saw the Jews in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But there's always that possibility that he might be kind of replicating that ideological view, even as he's trying to critique it. So I thought maybe you'd try to surprise us, undercut this image, but instead, in a way, it seems as though you turned it into a trap. Where it turns out she is evil. She is a goat in this, really stereotypical kind of, Satan is after us kind of fundamentalist Christian image of the goat's head and, satanic ritual as being, the end of everything we love and care about. Was that the intent, was to sort of bring us along with the character into a kind of trap and then, realize that in fact, the stereotype turns out to be absolutely true in this case?
I don't think that was entirely the intent. I think I wrote about this in my artist statement, where there are like a couple different interpretations on how you can assign the blame here. Like, obviously the mainstream route is, well, this girl's evil and she hides things about herself and she's bad. Like, yeah, like that's definitely like very easily like a takeaway you can get from like just those 4 pages. But I also raised the possibility in my artist statement of maybe thinking like, well, like you kind of like, at least personally, I can sort of sympathize with her, perhaps because she is just the most three-dimensional character in this comic, just by virtue of being the one who gets the most dialogue. Because I think that there is something like sad about that kind of situation where you feel yourself deprived from an ordinary adolescence just because your family is strange, or like you just have personal issues going on and you can't share it with people. And so clearly, like, that's something that readers can also keep in mind. It's not necessarily like it's open-ended so that you don't have to empathize with her and you can just be like, well, yeah, like she's crazy. But you can also think, well, maybe you should have just left it alone. Like maybe you shouldn't have followed her to her house and stalked her and invaded her privacy, which is why in that last page, she says like, I'm a monster, yeah, but for transgressing my boundaries, like, so are you. And so there are a lot of different assignments of blame here. And so I am really disappointed that I wasn't able to pursue the idea of like, you know, like the specification of characters being sort of used to reinforce existing prejudices. Because for instance, like racial imagery can get really sensitive with this. Like certain races that have been marginalized throughout history have been like phenotyped to be more like animalistic than others. And that's really awful. And so unfortunately, I wasn't able to really explore the way that this device can be politicized, but I do acknowledge that it can be very polarizing, which is why it's such an interesting thing to explore.
Absolutely. And I hope this will give you some impetus to try to take the experiment in a different direction, you know, and build on it in your own comics work and into a more satisfying conclusion for you. I think it seems like a good aesthetic as well as a cultural problem to tackle and to keep mulling over. So thanks for your thoughts about that. I have a question from Mary Flanagan, the chair of Film and Media Studies. This is a general question, I guess, for anyone who'd like to answer it. How do you feel your in-depth experience with comics might impact your work in other academic fields?
Well, you go.
Okay. Specifically taking this class, I found myself integrating a lot of comicking and cartooning within how I like interact with design, because I also took Engines 12 this term. So I really found basically how comicking and just the artistic medium of comicking with its parallel between how you can like, it gives it, with comics, you have the ability to verbally explain, but also like use like iconic imagery to like get a complex meaning across. And I guess like specifically with how I tackle design and how implementing just like composition, but also just, I don't know, just color. It all just makes, I don't know, it's very transferable between mediums, I guess.
Interesting. Other thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I took psychology alongside this course, and I found like there was like a lot of things in psychology that could like be applied to comics, and I thought that would be interesting because like you could use like scientific findings to like basically like, because like you know how like people are always like trying to like invent like new stuff to like advance like, I don't know, medicine or whatever, like you'd also like use like, I don't know, psychological findings to like better tell stories, which I thought would be like interesting to do. And also just like while doing my final project, it kind of felt more like an experiment than like a drawing, because I had to like, I don't know, like find like similar like concepts and like compare them like in, like, I don't know, like different contexts and stuff to like see like what was the deciding factor that made closure like this way as opposed to that way.
Yeah, we had a few students who had either were taking psychology courses simultaneously or even psychology majors in the class. And I think notions like closure and like just, you know, thinking about different panel well, aspect to aspect, you know, the different kinds of temporal relationships between panels really got a lot of people thinking about cognition and how cognition gets manipulated or cued in different ways by comics than perhaps by other kinds of media. Any other thoughts about this question about the general applicability of comics work to thinking about your own academic fields or other courses that you've taken? Yeah, Sophie, please.
I'll just say that bringing comics to my colleagues in comparative literature has been really fun. You know, they're all working on medieval folk tales and Spencer and stuff. And so talking about comics, I think really has enriched our conversation, especially in comparative literature, where when we're talking about current methods in the discipline, so much of it is about multilingualism and what does it mean to have world literature and to read across national literatures. And I think comics is really great because, you know, you can read comics without speaking the language that the words are written in. And so I think that it's been really helpful, at least for my group, to be thinking about this image of this idea of what does it mean for an image to be universal, and how can it transcend different cultures and different languages and be applicable and readable by people from many different places.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. Good. I'm glad it's been helpful for communicating with Spencerians in your quorum. In your quorum, Sophie. That's great. I never know how to talk to Spencerians myself, so it's a nice icebreaker. Question from Jess Smith, who designed the website gallery. How did you find drawing throughout the term influence your final project?
I can speak to that one because I did not consider myself an artist at the beginning of this term, at least someone who didn't draw at all.
Were you into comics, or was this more a
No.
curiosity? Okay, so
this was just a curiosity at first, and it developed into an obsession. And there are only a few people that I can blame for that. So yeah, but doing small exercises in drawing throughout the term not only gave me the opportunity to play with a lot of things and sort of, especially when we talked about style, develop and like growing into the limits of my own rendering and style, but also playing with some concepts in the class. I have some like very scribbly precursors to what I tried to do in my final project that showed up like in week 2 or 3. So I liked that sort of progressive approach.
I'd love to hear other people's opinions of this, not just perhaps of how drawing through the term influenced the final project, but also how you thought about the relationship between the sketch pad that you were working in, not just for the homework, but also the doodles and experiments that I asked you to try on and off for the quarter. Did you use your sketchpad as a way of like working out concepts on the ground from week to week, or did you primarily just use it to do the homework problems, or try to keep up with the assignments from the Brunetti book? How much were you actually doing criticism in a way by drawing comics, or is that an unfair question?
Oh, well, honestly, I don't know if I did so much criticism as I did like just try to draw as somebody who's never tried to draw before.
Mm-hmm.
So like I like pulled up videos on like how to draw like characters and stuff like that. So I feel like learning like to draw, I mean, well, you couldn't tell from like my stick figure drawings, like tried to do legit drawings, and like I think I sort of succeeded. So that's like what I used my sketchbook to do.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts about how the sketchpad might have influenced the work that you did in the final project?
I think the sketchpad was really helpful. Like as someone who like often like illustrates just for like a hobby, oftentimes I don't find myself really considering an audience because I keep a lot of my art to myself unless I make it for my friends. And so I think like knowing that it was going to be received by Professor Young at the very end made me want to think like, well, how will this be like interpreted and how will this be like received? Especially considering that a huge part of comics is also like layout and design and like not so much rendering sometimes, so much as like, like the dialogue and like the narrative. And so I think that trying to like make my art coherent really like helped me improve a lot. And I think also that like the fluid nature of the assignments for the sketchpad got me thinking about, like, for instance, how different art styles contribute to a narrative. Like, why choose a cartoonish art style over a more realistic one? Like, what are the different like ways you can render something, and what are the different like vibes, I guess, that you get from that? Really interesting things to consider.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to take a crack at it? Let me ask a general question about the things that we read and the things that we viewed. What for you were the most kind of inspiring or eye-opening or kind of, paradigm changing films or comics that we watched or read this term for you that made something click for you or brought an idea or a concept from comics or film or storyboard theory to life for you that without that experience, it might not have been quite as dynamic or dramatic for you. Anybody have any moments like that?
I think for me, it was the double whammy of reading Persepolis and then reading the essay on focalization right after each other. Those two hit me like a freight train, thinking about subjectivity in comics, and especially in autobiographical comics, how many layers of interpretation and reinterpretation events have before they're interpreted again by the reader. That took me on a ride for a little bit, in a really good way. So yeah, I guess in short, those two together.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think reading the focalization essay ended up changing entirely how I wound up approaching On a Sunbeam, the Tilly Walden book at the end, because suddenly there are all these questions about through whose lens are we seeing this particular scene that made all the difference in the world to what significance that scene actually has within the larger story. Anybody else?
I especially love the Doctor Strange comics. I feel like there was just a shift, specifically just when reading, or just when understanding like just the composition and the use of color specifically within the comic issue that we read. Aside from it having a very like psychedelic feel, it did really impress like the creation of worlds and the creation of just these just three-dimensional worlds, but also like perspective within and how that narratively interacts with a story that manipulates time and space because he travels through like different worlds. It just got really meta for me at the middle of the term. So
Right. For me, every time we hit a new story or a new comic or a new theory, it felt sort of like a reboot of the class, like every couple of weeks. So there was always something new to kind of energize us, and that was entirely accidental. But the styles of the different comics are so entirely different from one another as well that causes us all to have to kind of do a double take and refocus ourselves on the new kind of conceptual issues that are brought up by that particular style. Well, folks, it's 8 o'clock. I can't tell you how happy I am to see all of you again and to hear you talking about the work and about comics and about film. I'm sorry that we didn't gather everyone, but again, this was a completely voluntary event. So this was, all for you to just enjoy the work that you've done and to help others to enjoy it as well and see where you've come and what you're, what you're trying to do with comics and your ideas about them now. Thank you to everyone who came along to wish us well and to cheer on your your favorite cartoonist. I'm very proud of this class and just excited to know that they were ready and willing and able to share the work that they've done this term. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you in the funny papers, as they used to say. But in any event, I'll be seeing some of you next term in one of my film classes, I'm sure, and others. Please keep in touch. Let me know what you're doing with comics, what you're reading these days. I'm always interested in exchanging ideas, long after the class is over, because these classes never end. They just get rebuilt, reconstructed, changed around, in order to meet new interests and demands and just new material. So thank you, folks. One more round of applause for everybody, and take good care of yourselves. Have a great holiday and a happy 2021, because it certainly couldn't get any weirder than 2020 was. So take good care, everybody, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah.
Yes, you too.